Welcome to the weekend. Apologies for yesterday. This chapter was also another one. I didn't realize how long this chapter is, so let's get started. Part 3, the Nisei. So this is the second generation. They're first generation born in the United States, but in the Japanese American community, the generation born to the immigrant parents, they're called the Nisei. So chapter 6, this is before the war. There were similarities between the Issei and Nisei. Both groups were not equal under the law, even though they are citizens. They were also limited by racism and sexism, limited what their mother can and cannot do, and both of their lives were shaped by American history. However, the Nisei was native born. They could speak the language, speak English, read newspaper, drive a car. However, because she lives a significant amount of her daily life in the outside world, she was more vulnerable. Verbal assaults, limits on her career choice, housing, and where she can go for entertainment. These have a profound impact on her feelings of self-worth. Her life was divided into 4 eras: before the war, during the war, after the war, and the 1960s. So births, most of them were born between 1950 and 1940. The highest concentration between 1918 and 1922. This was because the flow of immigration from Japan ended abruptly in 1920. As a result, they have a shared generational experience and character. It must also be noted that this should not be a stereotypical image of Nisei, as each person is unique and may or may not have all the characteristics. So their identity, there were 2 dilemmas that they faced. On the one hand, they really wanted to adopt American attitudes and behavior. On the other hand, Americans did not want them. They ended up creating their own subculture. She grew up under humble conditions. Her parents were in a new country, went through the Great Depression. They learned from their parents to be frugal and hardworking as well as resourceful. Good Japanese versus good Americans. They were bilingual, bicultural. At home, they helped their mother prepare a traditional Japanese meal and spoke Japanese to her. Outside, they were getting ready for a date, went to a local diner to have a hamburger and milkshake, spoke English to each other. Being good Japanese wasn't about loyalty. Instead, it was about bringing pride and honor to the Japanese race. It included perseverance, self-restraint, reserve, sense of duty and obligation, be serious, honest, gentle, obedient, and filial piety. On the other hand, being a good American was about not standing out due to their race, because their position in society was already tenuous. This heightened consciousness of their actions was what they meant about being good Americans. So this created conflict between part of a deeply ingrained group, consensus building Japan, versus the primacy of the individual America. While Americans complained that the Nisei did not contribute verbally to the group, the Nisei complained the Americans talked too much with little to no action. For Japanese Americans, it was more important to do something for the greater good of the whole rather than be egocentric. Going alone to get along. The consequence of consensus is conformity. Nisei showed little negative deviant behavior. However, at the same time, the Nisei also showed little positive behavior, such as rebellion, disappointment, and individualism. As a result, they had a lifelong struggle with being assertive and independent. Generation gap. This generation gap was exacerbated by a huge age difference between their parents and the children. This gap created conflicts. The Issei community, almost exclusively Japanese, worked, socialized with their own kind, observed the behavior of their own culture. In sharp contrast, the Nisei rapidly adjusted to the American culture, spoke English almost exclusively to their peers. Their social lives were in a world that their parents didn't understand. While they struggled to create their own identity, they rebelled against their parents' authority. However, with the outside world being racist against them, the Issei and Nisei turned to each other for mutual affection, respect, and support. Political identity. The Nisei were taught Japanese cultural values by their parents. However, they identified more with America than Japan. This was during a time when the minorities could not join labor unions or live in a place of their choosing. They were not inclined to confront issues of race or inequality head-on. They generally did what their parents did: work hard, stay out of trouble, try to prove themselves worthy of citizenship. Japanese American Citizens League, 1930, this group was formed to create a favorable image of Japanese Americans as loyal and productive Americans. Before the war, they were seen as part of the Japanese American community, all-male, apolitical, national organization with no clear agenda. During the war, they were caught in the middle of being forced to choose between loyalty to the motherland Japan or the adopted homeland America. They encouraged all of Japanese Americans to comply with all government orders and prove that their only loyal to the United States. After the war, they worked to get rid of alien land laws, as well as get citizenship for everyone who made the United States their permanent home. Over the years, they have been accused of having a middle-class conservative agenda. They tend to be reactive rather than proactive toward issues. It went national in 1950. It is the only Japanese American organization. Membership continues to increase. There are collective voices of Japanese Americans that gain economic growth and political influence. Education. This was a priority in Japanese family. It's essential to elevate the Nisei status and long-term occupational goals. 1940, 60%. 3 out of every 5 Japanese American male high school students graduate versus 44% of the general population. For females, it was 54% Japanese American versus 38% general population. Most Japanese Americans were in school on the eve of the Second World War. They did not expect to go to college. Most took classes such as general education or commercial such as basic secretarial skills and homemaking. Most had pleasant experiences in school. Many excelled in school and enjoyed popularity among their classmates. The one class they suffered was English, because it was not spoken at home. High school, the racial division increased in high school. Although they made non-Japanese friends, they danced, went to football games, and dated their own kind. They were very well aware of the invisible line that barred them from interacting with white students. They did, however, form a Japanese club to carry out a social agenda, not for political purpose. The reason they did not participate in politics was because they knew that only very rich and very attractive classmates would become part of the student body government. Their lower economic and social status underscored their experience in high school. However, in schools with multi-ethnic student body, many Japanese Americans took leadership roles, were routinely selected to the office of student body president. For example, Ms. Nakamura attended a school where her closest friends were Jewish, Mexican, and Greek. She won several contests at school. After the war, she went on to Columbia University to earn a master's degree. It was difficult for her to find a teaching position. She did become a teacher at Oakland's Unified School District. When they published a photo of her, they labeled her as, air quotes, Hawaiian. She was honored as Teacher of the Year and became one of the administrators before she retired. College. Many did not go to college. One was cost. The money most the parents had for college went to their brothers. Daughters were expected to support the family. Another was limited career options available to Japanese Americans, especially healthcare and scientific fields. Third, daughters were expected to be a wife and mother. Mrs. Saito Howden was an exception. She was encouraged by her high school teacher and her mother to continue her education. A minister friend helped her with meals in exchange for room, board, and car fare. She went on to becoming a staff member at the International House of Berkeley, which is a student housing center at the University of California at Berkeley campus. Medical training. A few graduated from medical school, including Dr. Togasaki. She graduated from UC Berkeley in public health. From there, she was admitted to Johns Hopkins Medical School. She became chief of the Division of Preventive Services in Contra Costa County, California. Nurse training, a significant number went to nursing. This was a tradition of women to be caregivers, and opportunities for employment were decent, and they drew respect and prestige akin to teaching. However, it was not easy. Ms. Shimizu got her education from Los Angeles City College. However, few private hospitals would train these new nurses, so they had to go to a public hospital. To further their training, her options were limited, either a religious hospital, White Memorial, or Glendale Sanitarium. After 4 months at White Memorial, she was recruited as part of the initial group to go to the concentration camp in Manzanar. While she was there, she was escorted by the military police to Los Angeles to take her state board exam to become a registered nurse. Japanese school. On weekdays, they attended regular school. After school, they went to Japanese school. Their curriculum and codes of conduct were completely different between the two types of schools. In regular schools, they're jumping, screaming. In Japanese schools, they had to have a small and timid voice. One student complained that they went because their friends forced them. They didn't learn anything with the exception of a few letters of the Japanese alphabet. During the war, the military needed a lot of translators. English and German, English and Italian, English and Japanese. The military was stunned when they realized that only 15%, that's 10 plus 5% of them are bilingual, and only 5%, so even 1/3 of those, were biliterate. In their quest to become more America, they did whatever they had to do to forget their roots. Religion. Most rural Issei, 80% were Buddhist. In sharp contrast, only 30 to 36% of urban Issei were Buddhist. Only 11 to 12% of rural Issei were Christian, while over 53% of urban Issei were Christian. However, the parents' and children's religious preference did not create any conflict. For example, Ms. Murakami's parents were Buddhist. However, they attended Christian services at a friend's home before a Buddhist temple was built in their town. Our parents explained that what matters is the belief in the God. Buddhist temples that were created later accommodated needs of the English-speaking Nisei, however, did remain Japanese in character. Almost all of them had a home base in Japan. Priests were imported from Japan to minister in the United States. Until 1932, the students were actually sent back to Japan for training. Now, in 1932, a Nisei training program was finally underway. Sunday school was taught in Japanese. In urban areas, Nisei attended Christian churches because they were eager to be identified with anything American. Services in English, they had social and educational activities that were more in line with American life. They shied away from Buddhist temples because they were too Japanese-y. The funny thing is that today, that's exactly why people are interested in Buddhism, because it's so Japanese-y. In the early years, few Japanese Americans were ordained in the Christian ministry. Back then, most of them were headed by white Americans. Although they were kind and solicitous, they kept the same distance from the Japanese Americans. For Nisei girls and women, the church gave them spiritual nourishment and education, as well as important social base. Work. Nisei women knew the job opportunities are slim. Even if she got a job in the clerical field, she knew that she won't be promoted past the middle management. Around 1938, most could only find jobs in Chinatown or Japantown. They wouldn't even give these women a job application. Most either worked in the vegetable stand or did domestic work. 1940, 6,800 worked. Of those, 1,700 were domestic workers, 1,600 paid and unpaid farm workers. Others found to work as a seamstress or in ethnic companies, such as store clerks, salespersons, bookkeepers. About 300 were in combined professional technical workers. Domestic work, they accepted the same job as the mothers. Work was available, familiar with flexible hours. However, the Nisei saw domestic work as an interim job while they attend school or look for other jobs. During the war, many worked as domestic near the camp where their husbands were stationed. Today, their numbers are small. Farm work, rural Nisei women who were farm workers had less grueling job than their moms. They also lacked social contact with their peers unless they attended a church or organization. When they were ready to get married, their prospects were slim. One woman's parents offered her 3 potentials. She chose the wrong one and marriage was not happy. However, she stayed for the sake of their children. Plant nursery work, they were somewhere in between. Although they worked in the family-owned and managed plant nurseries, they weren't as isolated. Ms. Sugihara cooked for the entire family because her mother was ill most of the time. She attended school, Japanese student club functions at the high school. Other than like chores on the weekends and summer vacations, she didn't work in the family business. Before the war, she never ventured farther than a 2-hour drive from her family home. The milieu. In the few years before the war, then President's New Deal programs gave Japanese Americans reason to look optimistically to the future. Most families recovered from the Great Depression. Some owned homes, most owned a car. Many Nisei went to work, gave part of their earnings to their family. They could go out to a movie restaurant without too much financial strain. Other than school, Nisei rarely engaged in social activities outside the community. Late 1930s, they had their own network or organizations, hundreds of clubs, YWCA, athletic groups. They experienced little to no interference from their parents. Dancing was their favorite pastime. Their parents, rolled their eyes, shook their head. They were bewildered by this phenomenon. They said too much dance, dance. The pre-war years were a time of innocence. They dated, but not going all the way. Marriage is still held sacred, union ordered in heaven. He said girls held these norms more constantly than their counterparts. Kibe, a handful of Nisei were sent back to Japan to be educated in Japan's educational system. They were called Kibe. They numbered about 10,000. Most returned to the United States between 1935 and 1940. The question of whether to send their children to Japan for education was hotly debated. Some parents were all for making certain their children know their heritage. Others were strongly against separating the family unit, no matter what. Regardless of the argument, Kibe did suffer. Their command of Japanese language and culture was strong like their parents. However, due to the severe age difference, they didn't have anything in common with them. On the other hand, the Nisei who were educated in America saw them as, being fresh off the boat, too Japanese. As a result, the Kibe socialized with other Kibe. Also, with their limited language skills, they were forced to stay in blue-collar jobs, where their American-educated peers got white-collar jobs. Ms. Itami's story illustrated what other Kibe went through. When she returned to the United States after education in Japan, she worked as a waitress at the restaurant in Skid Row, now part of Los Angeles. 3 months later, she worked as a typesetter at a Japanese language newspaper. She spent her free time with other Kibe, forming a club where they shared stories and poetry. During the war, her husband volunteered for the armed services. After the war, he interrogated the prisoners of war. After the war, he could not cope. Ms. Itami also joined her husband in Japan and suffered with him. After he passed, she returned to the United States, remarried, had made a good life for her and their daughter. She continues to attend a local college to polish her English. War clouds. 1940, war was raging in Europe and Asia. Exactly when the Second World War started is a matter of debate. For example, early 1930s, Japan already controlled Manchuria, which was part of China, but today, after the Korean War, it's not part of North Korea. However, Japan controlled northern and central China by the end of 1938. When France fell to Germany, Japan invaded French Indochina. The United States called up support to Japan, because you gotta react to that. You can't do anything. Soon after, Japan aligned with Germany, Italy, so Japan, they pushed back, and this made the United States even more angry at Japan. In the United States, attitudes toward Japanese Americans were never civil to begin with. And again, this isn't just white Americans. Chinese Americans were also angry at Japan because they see what Japan is doing in China during the Second World War. Same with the Filipinos. We see after they see what Japan is doing in the Philippines as well. So it's not just white Americans. So I felt the need to make that clarification. 1941, diplomacy between the United States and Japan deteriorated at an alarming rate. So everything is just going through a downward spiral. In July, the United States completely stopped all support, froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain did the same. And obviously, Japan's going to also, push back. So Japan responded by freezing all U.S. and British assets in Japan as well. So, next video, I'll talk about what happened during the war. Questions, comments, constructive criticisms, ask you for clarification, let me know. And as I see you next time, take care. See ya.